if you look at where the country is today, where we are, would you say that we are on course to that great Nigeria that I believe most of us, if not all of us, have dreamt about?
I'm going to be 56 years old this year. And in my entire lifetime, we've never been further away from the path to greatness than we are today. The future of Nigeria appears more bleak today than it has ever been in my entire lifetime. I'm a student of history too. And with the possible exception of the period during which Nigeria fought a civil war, which is anything but civil, Nigeria has never been closer to the brink than it is today. So I am not very optimistic about the trajectory of my country.
Okay, so I would like to, deepen that a little bit. First of all, by saying, who and what circumstances will you hold responsible for that scenario that you have painted? And then later, I hope we get the time to talk about how do we get out of it. But first, who and what circumstances, Mr. Farotimi, do you hold responsible for the scenario you've painted?
I think the first thing is that there are enough blames to go around. Each and every one of us are to blame to varying degrees. But the most important thing that is responsible for where we are today is the complete breakdown of the rule of law. Nigeria, as it is today, is not ruled by law. It is ruled by impunity. It is ruled by the will of men and not by any institution or state or by the laws. And we have copious laws on our books, so it's not for the absence of the law, it's not for an absence of courts, but it is for the absence of the fact that there is simply no rule of law in Nigeria. The first thing that must exist in a space before you can speak to either democracy or citizens is the presence of the rule of law in that space. We are in a country where I cannot expect to get justice in the courts because the courts are no longer interested in imposing or ensuring the rule of law. That principal loss, more than anything else, is responsible for where we are today. When you've looked beyond that, you then begin to look at the institutions of states. You look at the police, you look at the custom, you look at the army, you look at the courts. What you find is almost a complete and total failure of each and every one of these institutions to do what it was designed to do. If anything, the laws are observed more in breach, and you find that it is a function of how the person who is meant to administer laws, but has become an administrator of impunity, feels about licensing the powers of impunity to whoever they care, or exercising the powers of impunity in respect to whoever they equally care. So, in the absence of the rule of law, you have complete putrefaction of each and every one of what should be institutions of state. That is why we are where we are.
Interesting. So if you just pick one of the issues that you raised, Mr. Farotimi, if you pick the issue of impunity, so we have a system, and I think this point has been well made, variously. I think there must be very few people in Nigeria who will compete, that claim of impunity. So I want to ask you, when you have a system that is, where we have so much impunity, like you have described, how do we break free of that impunity?
The first thing
yes, go ahead.
Okay. If you recall, when you asked the question originally, I was quick to admit to the fact that we are all to blame.
Yes.
When I was in the university, we had this hymn that we would sing before we start any student action. We call it Aluta back then. We will say, Gbogbo wọn náà lọ́wọ́ ń bẹ, Gbogbo wọn náà lọ́wọ́ ń bẹ, bí Nàìjíríà ti ṣe bàjẹ́, Gbogbo wọn náà lọ́wọ́ ń bẹ. And then we will proceed to mention the names of
Can you explain that in English? Translate.
Oh, I will.
Okay.
What it simply means is that they are all guilty, they are all complicit, and then we will begin to mention the names of those we consider the ruiners of Nigeria, who are mostly the military head of states and their civilian collaborators, because I went to university in the days of the military. However, in this age and time, the reality is that we are all to blame. There is no strata of the Nigerian society that is not complicit in the mess in which we have found ourselves, from the churches to the mosques to the professionals, from mechanics to carpenters to teachers to journalists. Each and every one of the strata of society have become complicit in the mess that we have found ourselves in. And if we are to ever come out of this, we must, as a matter of necessity, make individual commitments to change for the better. It's not just about replacing the persons who sit in the offices of government. We, in our private spaces, have to come to the knowledge of the fact that you cannot build anything enduring on the back of the lies that we have told ourselves. We have built a country effectively on lies. The pastors tell lies from their pulpit. The imams tell lies from their pulpit. Nobody speaks truth to power because they are all looking to benefit from the system. So if you say that what could we possibly do to change our lot, I am saying to you clearly that each and every one of us have to make a commitment to change where we are and who we are.
Well, I mean, quite compelling submission, Mr. Farotimi. In 2014, 2015, there was a huge groundswell in this country, that produced, which was denominated by the change mantra. And you could see that there was a groundswell of opinion in the direction of change. Nigerians expected change. Now, I don't think that change has happened, and that's a long story. But this is my question. Do you think the fact that today we have as president somebody who had always been an active participant in the quest for good governance, even better governance, somebody who has been a pro-democracy activist even before he became governor, and somebody who gives us the record, and we know of some of the things that happened in Lagos, fairly useful. Do you think that he can turn around the situation that this country is in today? I must ask you that question, Mr. Farotimi. Is there any chance at all that if we are going to live by what he says, we can begin to turn the direction in a good or a better trajectory? Mr. Farotimi.
One of the things that we have been very successful at doing is for our false narratives. We have created compelling lies that we have deluded ourselves into accepting as truth. One of them is where you started your question, the lies of 2014, 2015. I remember, not everybody bought into those lies. I remember very clearly that the essay that titled my first book, Do Not Die in Their War, published by Guardian on the 7th of February 2015, before the election, I said very clearly that there is an illusion of change being marketed, and that all you actually need to do to realize that it is delusional to believe in this lie is to look at the high table whenever they are talking about the APC. That each and every one of the persons sat on the high table is directly responsible for where we were as at that time. Nothing has changed between 2015 and today. Let's be clear about something. You said that the man had done some things in Lagos that should suggest to us that perhaps we'll see some changes in Nigeria. I put it to you, sir. Lagos is the 5th largest economy in Africa. I'm being told by multiple economists. What is it about the services and infrastructure in Lagos is suggestive of it being the 5th best in Africa? Is it the healthcare delivery system? The man built Lagos, quote and unquote, but he hasn't built a single healthcare facility in Lagos in 20-something years that is capable of treating his own many ailments. That is one. In Lagos State, for every government classroom, for every classroom built by the Lagos state government, and I'm not talking about those built in the last 20-something years, I'm talking about those that have been built from inception till date. For everyone, there are at least 4 private classrooms. That is telling you the total failure of the educational system in Lagos is completely, almost completely privatized. The ones that are in existence are so degraded that nobody who can afford it will send their children to those schools. That is what had been built in the last 25 years. When you now begin to look at the road infrastructure in Lagos State, my neighborhood, the Lekki-Ekpe axis, they've been building the single road in and out of my neighborhood for over 16 years. It's not been completed. It's a nightmare to travel that road. Those are the examples you have to look at when you begin to look at what he might be able to do at the federal level. The finances of Lagos State remains one of the most opaque in Nigeria. What is happening is that in the midst of the rot that Nigeria has become, we've been pointing to the lies and propaganda being told of a Lagos that has been built and that will be replicated at the federal level. They'll point at some moribund rail lines. Let's talk about that. 16 or 17 years at God knows how much inflated cost. They built the blue line. They're talking about a red line now. Question is, how much of that red line actually belongs to the federal government? How much of it was built by Lagos state government? At what cost? Fact of the matter is that if we actually look to the evidences of our eyes and we look to what we see within the state that the man has superintended for over 20 years in one form or the other, whether as governor or as godfather, reality is that it should tell us that we should expect nothing in Nigeria. And the evidence of the last 9 months are unimpeachable and cannot be denied. I know that the convenient excuse is always that Buhari had damaged it and is repairing it. But who brought Buhari? Who was the chief marketer of Buhari in 2014, 2015 when the change lie was sold to Nigerians? The fact of the matter is that until we all come to the knowledge of the fact that nobody is coming to save us but we ourselves, nothing is going to change. And there is nothing that has been done by this man to suggest that we should expect anything positive. In fact, we should brace ourselves for more to come.
Wow. Well, I mean, Mr. Farotimi, quite a very compelling argument that you put forward there. And I hope as to the questions that you have put out regarding the red rail and the blue rail, that we'll be able to get a little bit more clarity about it. One last question before you go, Mr. Farotimi. So, do you subscribe to any kind of political reforms, that might help the people to get out of what is clearly, something that is not worth the while, based on your description?
Let me tell you this. You can speak to political reforms in a society governed by law and that is rule-based. But this is not that society. What has happened is that with the ascension to office of the man known as Bola Ahmed Tinubu, an INEC that advertised beavers, transmission of election results from the polling unit level, unilaterally turned around and talked about glitches, and the courts decided to be legalistic in interpretation of clear provisions of the Electoral Act. So today, what the courts have said is that the INEC does not have to transmit results electronically. So we are back in a situation where someone like Wike is appointing his person as an INEC commissioner. So we are in a situation where whatever INEC says is the result is the result. And if you are now saying that we should look to reforms, question is, who is to reform our situation? Can we depend on beneficiaries of electoral highs to then reform themselves out of power? It is next to impossible. I have spent my time since after the election seeking to educate the Nigerian people to understand that they are the only ones who can rescue themselves from this mess. Nigeria is already headed almost inexorably towards a catastrophe. But the reality is that if the people are not carefully educated to understand that they are not each other's enemies, that the real enemies of the people are those who have ruined this country and placed us where we are. We will end up in an implosion. I fear that. I run away from that, and I seek to educate the people to understand that Chinedu, Ngozi, Wasiu, Kunle, Nodu, or Aminu, those are not the enemies. The enemies are the beneficiaries of this system. This system has to end one way or the other before Nigeria can be rescued. The beneficiaries of this system, both within and outside Nigeria, are taking too much pleasure, and they have no deterrence. They have nothing to gain from reforming it. They've successfully weaponized ignorance and poverty against the people, and they are they are so hard-headed, they cannot even see what is in their own enlightened, selfish interest, and they believe that they can sustain this evil reign. But I know human history has told me that this is not sustainable. My worry is that we don't end up in a cataclysmic situation. That is my sole worry. But to expect any change or self-reform from this system is delusional. It's not going to happen.
Nigerians must not be afraid of speaking the truth to power. A man dies only once. If you've killed Adiata, don't die yourselves. Yeah? But we will not forget. Now, it is 10 o'clock. Those of you who are just joining us, you missed a little bit there. So welcome once again. It's a brand new week. And we're starting today by looking at a Yoruba proverb that I shared with you earlier on. That's the scripture for the day. And what does it say? Àìsàn tó ń ṣẹgbẹ̀fà, òun ló ń ṣọ̀ọ́dúnrún. Àìsàn tó ń ṣàbọ̀yàdé, gbogbo ọlọ́yà ló ń ṣe. What does this mean? It speaks to the fact that what afflicts one afflicts all. My topic for today is the feudal republic of Nigeria. And I have picked that scripture very carefully because once upon a time when you speak of feudalism, it was almost always that you were speaking very clearly to something that you believe affects only the Fulanis and northern Nigeria. But unfortunately for us, the virus has jumped host, and it should be of interest to all Nigerians. Feudalism is no longer a construct that you find solely within the northern establishment, and it is no longer the affliction of Hausas and the Fulani peasantry or all the other persons who have been unfortunate enough over the course of history to be afflicted by it in northern Nigeria. Today, feudalism has become a Nigerian affliction because we are now living in the feudal republic of Nigeria. So let's deal with these issues. What is feudalism? Feudalism is essentially a governance, a social political construct that creates societies where there are overlords and then there are the serfs. What it simply means is that there is no equality within the society. Some people were born to rule. Remember that slogan. And some people are born to serve. And those who are born to rule are necessarily above the law. And those who are born to serve are meant to remain underfoot. In between the two extreme classes, you find those who are born to serve those who are born to rule. And by virtue of their proximity to power, they also acquire levels of impunity that are generally open and available to those born to rule. So if you are serving the master, you exercise the powers of the master, and sometimes you exercise these powers on your own behalf. So look at the average Nigerian policeman. The only reason he can turn to the citizen and tell the citizen, quote and unquote, I can shoot you and nothing will happen, is because he shoots people on behalf of his organ and nothing happens. So he knows that since he's going to use the same power and he has used the same powers on behalf of his masters, he could use the same powers in his own respect and on his own behalf without necessarily having to clear it with the master, because this is the power that he had been given over those he pretends to serve. Feudalism, in short, exists in places where the law does not rule and where there are no citizens. And that is the country, Nigeria. The law does not rule here. And regardless of how many times you call yourself citizens, you are not citizens. Let us trace the history of feudalism so that we might all have a clearer understanding of this. Long before the white men came to these shores, long before Mungo Park told us he discovered the Niger, way before there was a Nigeria, there was in northern Nigeria, or there were, I should say, two feudal states. These feudal states were the Kanem-Borno Empire, and there was also the Sokoto Caliphate. I will spare you the detail of their emergence, but suffice to say that long before the Sokoto Caliphate, there was a Kanem-Borno Empire. The Kanem-Borno Empire was essentially one that ran on the principle of feudalism, but in its classic form and in its expansionist manner, you didn't see feudalism emerge until the jihad of Uthman Dan Fodio and the establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate. The Sokoto Caliphate existed on the one single principle, feudalism. But it wasn't just feudalism as existed in Rumfa, with Rumfa before you had Usman Dan Fodio leading his jihad. What came with the jihad was a theocratic feudal state where people ran roughshod across vast parts of northern Nigeria in the name of Islam. But even as they preached Islam, even as they used Islam as the template and basis for legitimacy, there was a feudal state being established. In that feudal state, slave trade was the major item of trade. There exist records, even within the Emirates, the SLS, Sanusi, Lamido Sanusi, even told us when he was still the emir before he was deposed, that they have records in Kanu Emirate dating back hundreds of years that kept record of their trade with the Arab world. When you hear of the transatlantic slave trade, what is almost always forgotten is that long before there was a transatlantic slave trade, there was a trans-Saharan slave trade. That trans-Saharan slave trade was largely fed by the feudal states that had emerged in northern Nigeria. It wasn't by accident that by the time the British came, they found a thriving empire, the Uthman Dan Fodio one, that you will call the Sokoto Caliphate. That Sokoto Caliphate could have overran most of northern Nigeria, but it deliberately avoided doing so because once you conquer a space in an Islamic republic and in an Islamic state, you could no longer trade fellow Muslims because they will now have to convert to Islam once you conquer the territory. You could no longer trade them as slaves. Not being able to trade them as slaves meant that they were left unconquered, but what simply happened was that the Fulanis built garrisons across those territories. So you had garrisons in places like Nasarawa, Lafia, Suleja, in places like Bida. There were places where they built garrisons, but those garrisons were meant to make sure that the local population were kept in check. They were never truly taken as territories to be ruled directly, so they kept them almost as slave stock. But this is to help you understand and have clearer understanding of the historical basis of feudalism. Feudalism does not exist in the understanding that people should ever be equal. It was always so that Those who rule are above the law, above reason, and rule at pleasure. Now, when the British came, the British simply built on what they found and they called it indirect rule. So, even in places where the Fulani had not conquered the people, either deliberately or because they couldn't, in places like Suleja, in places like Abuja, for instance, the Gwari could not truly be conquered because of the rocky terrain of their neighborhood. They couldn't conquer those places. They simply raided them for slaves pre-colonial days. But by the time the colonial masters came, they extended the authorities of these Fulani emirs over those neighborhoods because it was convenient to simply rule using the existing system. They frowned against the Christianization of what were largely pagans, quote and unquote, because once they became Christians, they became more difficult for Fulanis to rule. So what you found was that the British came, built on top of what was in existence, legitimized what they found on the ground, and then in places like Eastern Nigeria, in the land of the Igbos, I think Igbos will say Igbos do not make kings. So what they simply did was to create warrant chiefs in Igbo land. In Yoruba land, where we had kings, our kings were not absolute rulers. There were checks and balances within our system that ensured that the commoners were not subject to the absolute powers of any king. So in Yoruba land, what they simply did was to strengthen the kings, but they could not get the same level of absolute powers vested in our kings, unlike what was already in existence, where they had feudal empires before their coming. So you have a situation now where all over Nigeria, in order to make sure that the British could rule without bringing the necessary manpower, they adopted their indirect rule. But the indirect rule that was adopted strengthened the existing feudal order. Now, this was the foundation of the feudalization of the place today called Nigeria. When the military, when the British left, or even before they left, of course, there were a lot of talks about citizenship, especially in southern Nigeria. And this was why the North refused to join the call for independence before 1960. You would have heard of an hour moving the motion years before. The North opposed it because they were afraid of the Western ideas of citizenship that were being preached in southern Nigeria. The British assured them that they needn't worry and they will be given a veto, which was why, go check your history. At every point when the Legislative Council was formed in Nigeria, the British were always careful to ensure that whilst the Western region would have 18 members, the Eastern region would have 18 members, the North was given 36. So it was always the number of seats allocated to the North was always the same as the combination of the seats given to the East and the West. That was the veto that was given from day one, and that veto continues until today. That is why you find that the combination of states in southern Nigeria almost always equals the number of states credited to northern Nigeria. This is the colonial construct. Nigeria was constructed as a feudal state from day one.